Hello everyone, my name is Shannon Hoy, and this presentation is on Chapter 5, entitled The Misdirection of Everyday Dialect, from Johnston's Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners. The first item on our agenda is to discuss key vocabulary terms from the chapter. Following that, I'm going to talk about briefly why the chapter is important. After that, we'll go over the chapter summary. Following that, we'll do chapter takeaways, and the last is I'm going to pose a question to the group to be discussed. The first key vocabulary term is parsimonious. Parsimonious is a form of the word parsimony, and if you remember, this was one of our vocabulary terms from Cooper's Chapter 1. As a reminder, this is the process in which you disqualify simple and logical answers before considering more complicated ones. So the example of this that I chose is from the TV show House. House says, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. The next key vocabulary word is teleology. Teleology is explaining phenomena that depends on the contribution of final causes. So what does this mean? An example of this could be asking why a knife has a sharp edge. The teleological answer would be because the sharp edge helps a human cut something that they otherwise would not have been able to. These were the only two terms that I felt needed a review, so let's move on to why the chapter is important. The chapter very nicely complements the Skinner chapter because it more thoroughly discusses the importance of language use in ABA. It goes deeper in explaining terms like knowledge and purpose, which are so commonly used in layman's language. Now let's move on to the chapter summary. Johnston's first section is called Knowledge and Understanding. He explains that knowledge is a colloquial explanation of observed behavior, and he explains that there is a distinction between knowing about something and knowing how to do something. An example of knowing about something would be the following. I know a lot about the New York Yankees. This is a colloquial way to say that I have observed my own high frequency of behavior of talking about the New York Yankees. An example of knowing how to do something would be the following. I know how to play softball. This is a layman way of saying I have observed a high frequency of me playing softball. Johnston completes the thought by saying that knowledge and understanding are not some philosophical mental process, but rather how the typical human has learned to describe his behavior. Before moving on to the next section, I'm briefly going to talk about box 5.1 on page 102. This box complements Skinner's chapter 8 very nicely. Johnston states, reasons for any action are complex, largely historical, and usually not obvious, whether the behavior is public or private. Again, having an idea, or having a reason, or having knowledge are all ways people have resided to describe behavior, albeit not an efficient way to describe behavior. Johnston is saying that although it may be difficult to identify, there is a preceding event to all behaviors. Recall that this is also called determinism. And even though it can be hard to find at times, we as BCBAs should be able to accurately define the preceding and influencing events to a behavior. Very frequently, my husband will ask me while I'm running around the house, opening cabinets, looking under chairs, pulling up seat cushions. Does this sound familiar to anyone? I hope so. Well, anyway, I would normally respond by saying, I'm doing XYZ in order to find my phone. A side note to make is that my son is in this mischievous, I like to hide mommy's things phase. So this happens quite often. What I should actually say is that because I have a history of finding what I'm looking for contingent on searching in this manner, opening cabinets, pulling up cushions, etc., so I am behaving in a manner that will likely result in finding what I am looking for. In this section, Johnston cautions that explanations framed in terms of final causes are called teleological, and especially problematic for the science of behavior. Referring back to the example regarding my lost phone, when I said I was behaving in a way in order to find my phone, this is teleological and therefore an inaccurate way to describe my behavior. Again, going back to my Skinner video on Chapter 8, it would be wrong for me to say I'm going to study in order to get a good grade. What I should and what I really mean to say is, in the past, studying before an exam has been reinforced by performing well on the exam. So the probability of me studying before an exam in the future has been increased. In box 5.2, Johnston is discussing the concept of planning. Again, this is a difficult behavior to dissect because the anteceding events can be very ambiguous. An example is the following. The motivating operation is being in a deprivation state because of not going to Disney World in the past 10 years. The discriminative stimulus could be seeing a commercial for Disney World. The behavior is planning to go to Disney World by booking flights, hotel rooms, saving money, etc. And the stimulus would be your sister calling to talk about the trip. Johnston states that problem solving is when a person has no behavior immediately available that can resolve a condition of deprivation or aversive stimuli. We are taught techniques in order to respond to these types of conditions, like arranging and rearranging stimuli, or listening and reviewing possible solutions, and it is these techniques which are said to be problem-solving techniques. I'll tell you about a time when I took my son to some department store, and I'm a first-time mom, and he was only a few months old, so I did something very silly and left home without the diaper bag because we'd be fine. Obviously, the moment we were in the department store, he had one of the dirtiest blowout diapers I have seen to this day. The aversive condition in this scenario is the mess of a diaper. The condition deprivation is not having a clean diaper or wipes to change the situation. The final section in this chapter is rules, advice, and instructions. Johnston says that rules, advice, and instructions are often verbal, discriminative stimuli, and presented under control of some relation between behavior and its consequences. But Johnston goes on to explain that the function of rules, advice, and instructions are to provide an alternative to the learner relying on natural contingencies in order to alter his behavior. An example of this is when my parents brought us to the Grand Canyon when we were young. There were no railings along the edge of the canyon, and my parents had told us to stay X feet back from the edge and to hold their hand. The alternative to their warning would be the possibility of the natural contingency of falling into the canyon to our deaths. Johnston also says that the more precise and consistent the rule is, the more likely it will be followed. This is a really important tool in the classroom setting. On the first day of class, my students and I made a list of 4 rules to follow, and every day before class begins, we go over the rules. The most important part to note about a rule's effectiveness is the consistency of consequences and the applicability. So anyone who's ever been on Mason's campus knows that the no smoking signs posted on the buildings are laughable in respect to their effectiveness, because there are no consequences in respect with punishing the smoking in front of the building or reinforcing not smoking in front of the building. In the same stroke, if someone were to see me standing in front of one of those signs, they may say, "Hey, that lady's following the rules. Way to go." But the reality is that I don't smoke, so the rule is henceforth not applicable to me. So now let's talk about the takeaways. Johnston's readings are sometimes difficult to navigate because he so quickly transverses between talking about what is the correct thing to say and what is the incorrect thing to say. Because of this level of difficulty, it is also troublesome at times trying to define what the key takeaways are for the chapter. The key notes to make for this chapter is that knowledge and purpose are words used by a layman in order to describe a history of behavior and its contingent consequences, and how that has increased or decreased the probable frequency of occurring in the future. The second key note is that following of rules and advice and instructions is based on a person's history of similar conditions. So this is very applicable concept for parents, teachers, and BCBAs, etc. Because the person's history of either increased or decreased probably frequency of behaving according to those rules in the future. Now my question for the group. A child is refusing to put on their seatbelt, and the parent tells you that the reason the child is not doing this is because he doesn't like the feel of the seatbelt on his neck. What would be the response to the parent regarding the child's not adhering to the seatbelt rule? These are the textbooks that I used for this presentations, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you.